They told him winter in the mountains takes everything: food, warmth, hope. A wounded American veteran and his aging K9 were supposed to survive on canned meals in silence, buried under snow and forgotten by the town above them. But beneath an old house in Leadville, Colorado, something impossible was quietly taking shape. A hidden space, a risky idea, and one last mission no one believed would work. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Leadville, Colorado sat high enough that winter didn't simply arrive. It occupied the town like a long, deliberate siege. In January of 1996, the streets were narrowed by walls of plowed snow that had turned gray at the edges, and the wind came down off Mount Elbert with the blunt certainty of something that had never learned mercy. At dusk, the cold tightened the air until every sound felt sharper: the distant scrape of a shovel, the dry snap of a flag on a pole, the muffled churn of a pickup climbing an icy grade. The old mining town looked beautiful from a distance: Victorian brick fronts and weathered timber, porch rails buried to the knee, but up close it was a place that demanded you pay rent in effort. Ethan Cole had learned that kind of truth twice: once in uniform, and once after he came home and realized peace could be as complicated as war. He lived on the eastern edge of town in a small, raised-frame cabin that had been patched and repatched over decades, its paint gone thin and chalky, its porch steps worn into shallow bowls. He was 36 and built like someone who had once been broader, shoulders still square, chest still strong. But the shape was tightened now by restraint, by pain, by the constant calculation of how to move without reminding his body of what it had lost. A shrapnel injury in his left leg had left him with a permanent hitch and a long, pale scar that pulled when the temperature dropped. He kept his hair cut short in the military habit, dark brown, already threaded with a few early grays, and he wore a beard not because he liked it, but because shaving felt like an unnecessary ritual on days when simply getting dressed took discipline. His face had angles that suggested both youth and wear: a straight nose, a jaw that clenched when he concentrated, and eyes the color of wet slate that rarely wandered, as if his gaze had been trained to stay on what mattered. People in town described him in practical terms: quiet, polite, not unfriendly, just difficult to approach. And that was mostly true. Ethan could talk when he needed to. He could nod, smile, exchange a few sentences at the feed store or the post office. But there was a distance in him that had been carved by events no one in Leadville had witnessed: nights under foreign skies, the dull throb of adrenaline, the moment after an explosion when the world goes briefly silent and your mind tries to decide whether you're alive. The war had not made him cruel. If anything, it had made him careful, attentive to small risks, allergic to wasted motion, and quietly protective of those who didn't have the luxury of being careless. The only creature that saw him without that distance was Rex, his retired K9 partner, a German shepherd with a thick sable coat and a faint whitening along the muzzle that suggested age but not weakness. Rex was 9, old for a working dog, and moved with the controlled economy of an animal that had spent years learning that stillness could be as useful as speed. His ears remained sharply expressive, one slightly nicked at the tip from an incident Ethan never talked about. His eyes were a warm amber brown that could soften into affection or narrow into focus in a heartbeat. Rex had a wide chest, strong forelegs, and a tail that didn't wag frivolously. When Rex wagged, it meant something. At home, he was gentle in a way that surprised strangers. He accepted Ethan's touch like a promise kept, followed him from room to room without crowding, and slept at night near the bedroom door as if guarding an invisible boundary. In town, people treated Rex with a careful respect. Some offered their hand for him to sniff, most kept their distance, and Rex tolerated them the way a professional tolerates small talk: patient, alert, uninterested. That evening, the cold was especially vicious, the kind that made the windows creak softly as the house contracted. Ethan had spent most of the day doing small maintenance tasks that helped him feel in control: splitting a limited stack of dry pine, checking the truck battery, laying out tomorrow's groceries as if order could insulate him. Around 6, the heater began to click and cycle too frequently. He listened to the rhythm for a minute, then the familiar irritation of a problem he couldn't ignore settled into his chest. A draft had been whispering up through the floor for days. Now the air felt sharper, and the corners of the living room seemed to cool faster than they should. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen drawer, pulled on his heavy jacket, and moved toward the narrow stair door that led to the basement crawl space. Rex rose instantly, nails tapping the floor once, then twice. His head angled as if waiting for an instruction that didn't need to be spoken. "With me," Ethan said anyway, not loudly, not dramatically, just a phrase that made his own body remember how to move. The stairwell smelled like old wood and dust. The first step creaked under Ethan's weight, then the second. He descended slowly, mindful of his leg, one hand on the rail, the flashlight beam bouncing across exposed beams and insulation that had sagged in places. The crawl space under the house was more basement than cellar, though barely. A low-ceilinged rectangle of packed earth and rough concrete footings, with old storage shelves on one side and a heater unit on the other, its ducting patched with tape. It was a place most people avoided unless they had to. Ethan had avoided it too, but necessity has a way of turning discomfort into routine. Rex followed behind him, shoulders low so he didn't bump the ceiling, his breath steady, not anxious, just present. As soon as Ethan's boots hit the dirt floor, he felt it. Not warmth like a fire, not comfort, but a difference, a subtle pocket of air that didn't bite as hard as the air above. It was the kind of detail that would have meant nothing to him years ago. Now, his whole life was details, what hurt, what held, what failed slowly before it failed suddenly. He aimed the flashlight at the heater, checked the pilot, ran his hand along a duct seam, and found a gap where cold air was intruding. He cursed under his breath and reached for the screwdriver. Rex moved ahead, sniffing, then stopped dead near the southern wall, where a small ground-level window had been half covered by drifted snow outside. The dog's posture changed, head lower, ears forward, attention locked, not in alarm but in investigation. Ethan watched him for a second, then returned to the duct, until Rex gave a soft, single huff that Ethan recognized as a request. Not a warning, a suggestion. Ethan paused, straightened, and limped closer. The window was old, the frame warped, the glass clouded with grime, but a thin ribbon of twilight still slipped through. Rex stood with his nose near the sill, then sat, calm, deliberate, like he'd found a boundary worth noting. Ethan knelt, feeling his knee protest, and held his hand near the wall. The air there was different, less drafty, more stable. The earth along the foundation felt faintly warmer than he expected, as if it had been holding onto a memory of summer beneath all the snow. Above them, the floorboards were warm from the heater cycling in the living room. The heat was not vanishing upward the way people always said it did. Some of it was sinking, spreading, pooling down here in this ignored space. Ethan sat back on his heel, the flashlight resting on his thigh, and let the observation settle. His mind, trained by years of scanning for threats and solutions, began turning the idea over without permission. Wasted space, hidden insulation, a south-facing window, snow as a windbreak, thermal mass in the earth, heat already being paid for because the house had to be warm anyway. He looked at Rex, who met his gaze with that steady, unblinking patience that had once kept Ethan alive. The dog's expression wasn't human, but it had a clarity Ethan trusted. This place is workable. Ethan exhaled. A slow cloud in the beam of the flashlight. For the first time in days, the tightness in his chest eased, not because the cold had softened, not because the world had changed, but because he had found something he could build on. Upstairs, he had cans and dry goods and the same tasteless winter meals he'd been chewing through since December. Down here, he had a pocket of possibility. He wasn't ready to call it hope. Hope was a word people threw around too easily, but he could call it a plan. He reached out and scratched Rex behind the ears, and Rex leaned into his hand with quiet approval. Ethan stood, shifted his weight carefully, and glanced once more at the small window and the earth beside it. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Let's see what you're trying to show me. He climbed back up the stairs with Rex behind him, the wind rattling the cabin siding like knuckles on a door. And in the kitchen light, he opened a notebook he hadn't touched since his last job application. On the first clean page, he wrote 2 words, simple, practical, almost embarrassing in their optimism: under-house garden. He paused, listening to the heater cycle, then added a question mark. Outside, Leadville's winter continued as it always did, indifferent and exacting. Inside, a new kind of mission began, small enough to fit beneath a house, but large enough to change the way Ethan Cole might survive the rest of the season. Morning in Leadville arrived without ceremony. The sky was a thin metallic blue, and the cold had settled into the bones of the town overnight, tightening hinges and stiffening breath. Ethan Cole woke before dawn, not because he needed to, but because his body had never quite learned how to sleep past the point of readiness. Rex lifted his head from the rug beside the bed as soon as Ethan swung his legs over the edge, amber eyes alert but calm, tail giving a single restrained thump against the floor. Ethan dressed slowly, layering wool and canvas, his movements practiced and economical. The scar in his left leg pulled as it always did in the morning, a reminder that some damage didn't announce itself loudly. It simply insisted on being remembered. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee strong enough to bite back, then stood by the window and watched the first light catch the snowbanks along the road. The idea from the night before hadn't faded with sleep. If anything, it had sharpened, arranging itself in his mind with the quiet insistence of a problem that wanted solving. He opened the notebook again and found the words he'd written, under-house garden, waiting for him like a dare. Ethan didn't add to it right away. He believed in letting plans earn their way forward. He started with the practical work he couldn't avoid. After breakfast, he took Rex out along the plowed path that circled the edge of town, the dog moving at an easy trot that matched Ethan's uneven pace. The air smelled like pine and old snow, and the crunch underfoot was rhythmic, almost meditative. They passed a few early risers, men in heavy coats heading to jobs that existed more from habit than profit, and exchanged nods. Leadville was small enough that everyone recognized everyone else, but private enough that no one asked questions unless invited. On the way back, they stopped at the feed and hardware store, a low building with frost etched along its windows. Inside, the air was warmer and carried the mixed scent of grain, oil, and damp wool. Behind the counter stood Caleb Horn, a man in his late 50s with a beard gone fully gray and a posture that suggested years of lifting things heavier than he should have. Caleb's face was broad and weathered, with deep lines carved by wind and a habit of squinting even indoors, as if the world were always a little too bright. He'd grown up in Leadville, left once for a few years, and come back when his father's health failed. The return had hardened him in subtle ways, giving him a patience that came from understanding how often plans didn't pan out. "Morning, Ethan," he said, voice rough but not unfriendly. "Cold enough for you?" Ethan gave a small smile. "Has been," he replied. He didn't buy much, just a roll of weather stripping, a small bag of fasteners, and a cheap thermometer with a metal hook. Caleb rang it up without comment, then glanced down at Rex. "That dog's got good eyes," he said. "Doesn't miss much." Rex met his gaze briefly, then looked away, uninterested in praise. Ethan felt a flicker of something like pride quickly contained. Back home, Ethan spent the late morning measuring. He moved through the house with a tape measure and a pencil tucked behind his ear, noting distances, angles, and the way sunlight shifted across the floor as the day progressed. He checked the crawl space again, this time with intention rather than irritation, kneeling carefully and holding the thermometer near the southern wall, then near the heater duct, then along the packed earth. The numbers weren't dramatic, but they were consistent, and consistency mattered. Rex followed, stopping where Ethan stopped, sitting when Ethan knelt, his presence steady enough to make the low ceiling feel less confining. Ethan found himself talking aloud, not to the dog exactly, but not to him either, murmuring calculations and possibilities. He'd learned in the service that saying things out loud forced them to become real, forced you to hear where your assumptions might be wrong. Heat rose, yes, but it also moved sideways and down when given a path. Snow insulated. Earth held memory. The house already paid the cost of warmth. The question was, how much of that cost was being wasted? He marked a rough outline on the dirt with the heel of his boot, then wiped it away, dissatisfied. Plans were cheap until you tested them against the limits of material and time. By early afternoon, the sky had clouded over and the light flattened into something duller. Ethan took a break, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee reheated and a stack of old magazines he'd bought for pennies at a yard sale the previous summer. They were practical things, outdated homesteading guides, back issues of agricultural journals, more nostalgia than instruction, but he flipped through them anyway, scanning for diagrams and marginal notes. Most of what he found was irrelevant to a Colorado winter, but one article caught his eye, a brief mention of cold frames used to start seedlings early, with a sketch showing angled glass trapping sunlight close to the ground. Ethan studied the drawing longer than he needed to. The scale was wrong for his situation, the context different, but the principle was sound. He tore out the page carefully and set it beside the notebook. Rex sprawled near the stove, lifted his head at the sound, and watched with mild interest. Later, as dusk crept in again, Ethan heard a knock at the door. He stiffened instinctively. Unexpected visitors still did that to him, then relaxed when he recognized the silhouette through the frosted glass. Sarah Whitlow stood on the porch, her shoulders hunched against the cold, dark hair pulled back into a practical braid that rested between her shoulder blades. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and spare, with a runner's build and a face that seemed perpetually undecided between severity and kindness. Her skin was pale from the winter, her eyes a clear hazel that missed very little. And when she smiled, it was usually small, as if she didn't want to promise more than she could deliver. She taught biology at the high school and had moved to Leadville 5 years earlier after a divorce that people spoke about only in vague terms. The experience had given her a directness that some found bracing and others found uncomfortable. Ethan opened the door, and Rex appeared at his side without sound, posture neutral. "I brought your mail," Sarah said, holding up a thin stack of envelopes. "Caleb said you'd probably come by earlier. He forgot to give these to you." Ethan took the mail, nodded. "Thanks," he said. Sarah hesitated, then glanced past him into the house, eyes catching briefly on the notebook open on the table, the page torn from the magazine. "You working on something?" she asked, not prying so much as curious. Ethan considered deflecting, old habit, but found he didn't want to. "Thinking about it," he said. "Come in for a minute, it's warmer." She stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat, and Rex sniffed her boots once before losing interest. Sarah stood by the table as Ethan poured her coffee. "I was in the crawl space last night," he said, keeping his tone even. "Found it warmer than it should be. Got me thinking about wasted heat." Sarah's eyebrows lifted slightly, interest peaked. "Wasted heat is my favorite kind of problem," she said, a hint of dry humor surfacing. Ethan showed her the thermometer readings. The sketch from the journal, the rough notes in his book. He didn't oversell it. He laid out the constraints as carefully as the possibilities. The cold, the limited light, the cost. Sarah listened with the focus of someone used to evaluating systems rather than ideas, nodding occasionally, asking precise questions. "If you can stabilize above freezing," she said finally, "you don't need miracles. You need margins. Plants are more forgiving than people think if you respect their limits." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest at that, validation without enthusiasm, the kind he trusted. They talked for another 20 minutes, the sky outside darkening to indigo. When Sarah left, she paused at the door. "If you want," she said, "I've got some old lab thermometers, more accurate than that thing." She nodded at the cheap gauge on the table. Ethan nodded back. "I'd appreciate that." After she'd gone, he stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, Rex leaning against his leg, and realized the plan had gained weight. It wasn't just a thought anymore. It had edges, witnesses, and the first small tools laid out on the table. He closed the notebook and wrote a new line beneath the question mark, careful and deliberate. Test heat. Limit loss. Start small. Upstairs, the heater hummed on, doing what it had always done. Downstairs, the space waited. The first real test came sooner than Ethan Cole expected, and it arrived the way most meaningful lessons did in his life, not with drama, but with quiet resistance. The morning after Sarah Whitlow's visit, the sky pressed low and heavy over Leadville, clouds thick enough to dull the light into a flat pewter smear. Snow fell in fine grains rather than flakes, the kind that slipped into seams and cracks and stayed there. Ethan moved through the house with purpose, the notebook tucked under his arm, Rex pacing him with the unspoken understanding that something new was underway. He began by sealing what he could. Weather stripping went around the basement door, foam packed into the most obvious gaps along the southern wall, rags stuffed where the sill had warped away from the frame. It wasn't elegant work, but it was honest. Ethan believed in first passes, temporary fixes that taught you where the real problems lived. By mid-morning, he had rigged his first experiment. It was modest to the point of embarrassment, a shallow wooden crate salvaged from an old shipment of stove parts, lined with black plastic cut from a contractor's bag and filled with a thin layer of soil he'd stored in a barrel since autumn. He set it near the southern window, where Rex had paused the night before, angled slightly toward the light. The thermometer hung from a nail above it, the cheap metal hook creaking faintly as it swung. Ethan stepped back, wiped his hands on his jeans, and waited. Waiting had always been the hardest part. In the service, waiting meant listening to your own breath and the sound of blood in your ears while the world decided what it would take from you. Here, waiting meant watching numbers crawl. The temperature rose slowly, a degree at a time, until it stalled just above freezing. Ethan adjusted the crate, nudged it closer to the wall, then farther away. He added a flat stone he'd painted black the night before, hoping it would absorb what little light filtered through the cloud cover. Rex lay down a few feet away, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert, as if he understood that this stillness mattered. By early afternoon, the thermometer had climbed to 38 degrees and refused to budge. Ethan frowned, scribbled notes, and tried not to feel the old irritation. Failure wasn't new to him, but it still carried a familiar sting. He had wanted proof, something definitive. Instead, he had ambiguity. The day worsened. The clouds thickened, and the light drained away entirely. When Ethan checked again near dusk, the temperature had slipped back down, hovering just above freezing like a taunt. He cursed softly and sat on the bottom step of the basement stairs, elbows on his knees. Rex rose and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg, solid and warm. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's neck, fingers sinking into the dense fur, and forced himself to breathe. This wasn't a disaster. It was data. He knew that, the same way he knew the difference between a failed maneuver and a bad plan. The plan wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. That night, the cold sharpened. The wind came up hard from the northwest, rattling the siding and driving snow against the house with a sound like thrown sand. Ethan woke at 3 a.m. with his jaw clenched and his heart racing, the old reflex dragging him out of sleep before his mind could catch up. Rex was on his feet instantly, ears forward, body angled toward the basement door. For a moment, Ethan thought the heater had failed, but the house was still warm. He pulled on his boots and went downstairs, the flashlight beam bouncing as his leg protested. The thermometer read 34 degrees. The crate of soil was cold to the touch. Whatever warmth had gathered during the day had bled away into the night, swallowed by the wind and the earth's relentless hunger for equilibrium. Ethan stood there longer than he needed to, staring at the numbers until they blurred. Failure, when it came quietly, had a way of inviting old memories in through the cracks. He spent the next morning restless and irritable, the kind of mood that made even small tasks feel like insults. Rex sensed it and kept his distance, following but not crowding, his usual steadiness now edged with caution. Ethan recognized the pattern and resented it. He had worked too hard to let frustration turn him into someone brittle. He took Rex out early, choosing a longer route that led past the old rail spur where snowdrifts piled high against rusted tracks. There, they encountered Thomas "Tom" Avery, a man in his early 40s with a face that looked permanently wind-chapped and a beard that grew unevenly, as if he'd never quite learned how to maintain it. Tom was leading a small pack horse, an aging bay mare named Luna, her coat thick and dull from winter, her gait slow but steady. Tom made his living hauling supplies up to remote cabins when trucks couldn't make it, a job that had cost him a shoulder injury years earlier and given him a reputation for stubborn reliability. He nodded at Ethan, eyes flicking briefly to Rex. "Cold's not letting up," he said, voice flat. "Broke a water line up on County Road 12 last night. Took hours to thaw." Ethan nodded back. "Feels like it's testing us," he said, surprising himself with the admission. Tom snorted softly. "It always is. Questions whether you learn fast enough." Luna shifted her weight and blew out a slow breath, steam curling from her nostrils. Rex watched her with professional interest but made no move. The encounter was brief, but it stayed with Ethan as he walked home. Learn fast enough. That, at least, was familiar territory. By afternoon, Ethan had reframed the failure. Heat loss at night was the problem. He needed mass insulation, something that could hold on to warmth when the sun disappeared. He remembered Sarah's words about margins and thought of the black-painted stones he'd scattered half-heartedly. Not enough. He needed volume. He drove to the edge of town and filled the bed of his truck with river stones, smooth, dark, heavy, grunting as he lifted them, ignoring the protest in his leg. Rex supervised from the tailgate, head tilted, approving the selection with the seriousness of a foreman. Back home, Ethan stacked the stones along the southern wall beneath the window, building a low barrier that felt more like a promise than a solution. He poured water over them from a kettle heated on the stove, watching steam rise briefly before fading. It wasn't elegant, but it was progress. That evening, Sarah stopped by again. Lab thermometers wrapped in newspaper under her arm. She took in the scene quickly, the stones, the crate, the scattered tools, and didn't smile. "Rough day?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. "Learned what doesn't work," he said. She nodded, setting the thermometers on the table. "That's not nothing." She followed him downstairs, crouched to read the numbers, and listened as he explained the overnight drop. "You're losing heat faster than you can store it," she said, matter of fact. "Wind's stripping it away. You'll need to block more air movement, even if it means sacrificing some light." Ethan grimaced. "Trade-offs," he said. Sarah glanced at Rex, who sat patiently near the stairs. "Everything's a trade-off," she agreed. They talked through options, temporary barriers, angled reflectors, the possibility of banking snow intentionally rather than fighting it. When she left, the plan felt heavier, more complex, but also more real. Late that night, after the house had settled and the wind eased slightly, Ethan checked the basement one last time. The stones were cool, but not cold. The thermometer hovered a few degrees higher than the night before. Not enough to celebrate, but enough to note. He wrote it down carefully, then closed the notebook. Failure hadn't ended the mission. It had defined it. Upstairs, Rex curled on his rug with a satisfied sigh. Outside, winter held its ground. Inside, Ethan Cole adjusted his expectations and prepared to try again. Snow returned overnight, not with fury but with persistence, laying itself down in patient layers that softened edges and hid mistakes. Ethan Cole woke to a muffled world, the kind that made sound feel optional. The heater cycled steadily, a low mechanical breathing that anchored the morning, and Rex rose from his rug with a stretch that pulled the stiffness from his back before settling into watchfulness. Ethan took his coffee to the window and studied the yard, noting how the drifts banked against the southern wall had grown higher, tighter, like a deliberate barricade. He didn't smile, but something in his posture eased. The previous night's marginal improvement, the stones holding a few degrees more warmth, had been enough to justify the next step, not expansion, consolidation. He believed in quiet builds, change that didn't announce itself until it had already taken hold. He spent the morning preparing materials, moving with care that came less from caution than from respect for the process. Old lumber was sorted by straightness and soundness, nails cleaned and set aside by size, a handsaw sharpened until it whispered through scrap without complaint. Rex followed, pausing to inspect each pile as if memorizing the layout. Ethan's plan was not to erect anything permanent yet, but to shape air, to redirect it, slow it, give it reasons to linger. He framed a temporary baffle along the southern wall inside the crawl space, using thin plywood scavenged from a neighbor's remodel, angling it to block the most aggressive drafts while leaving a channel for light. He sealed seams with a mix of foam and cloth, an inelegant but effective compromise that acknowledged Winter's impatience. The work took longer than he expected. It always did when he was careful. Around midday, a truck pulled up outside, tires crunching softly. Ethan stiffened, then relaxed when he recognized the vehicle. An older Ford with a mismatched tailgate. Marion Pike stepped out, a woman in her early 60s with short silver hair cut blunt and practical, her frame compact and solid, as if built to withstand years of cold. She wore a heavy coat cinched at the waist and boots scuffed from use, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to rely on her own judgment. Marion had run the town's library before retiring the previous year. A stroke had slowed her speech just enough to make people underestimate her, a habit she found mildly amusing. She held a small box against her chest and waved once, decisively. Ethan opened the door, Rex appearing at his side. "Heard you were measuring the ground," Marion said without preamble, her voice steady, words chosen carefully. "Brought something you might want." Inside the box were rolls of reflective insulation, the kind used behind radiators to push heat back into rooms. "Donated," she added. "I had them in storage. Figured they'd do more good here." Ethan thanked her, meaning it. Marion glanced at Rex, nodded approval. "Good dog," she said. Rex accepted the assessment without comment. They went downstairs together, Marion moving slowly but without hesitation, her eyes sharp despite the dimness. She listened as Ethan explained the adjustments, the failures, the incremental gains. She asked few questions, but the ones she did ask went straight to the heart of things. Where the cold entered fastest, how moisture behaved, what he intended to do when temperatures dropped further. When he showed her the stones, she knelt and pressed her palm against them, testing. "Mass helps," she said, "but reflection will help too. Make the heat argue with itself." Ethan installed the insulation along the baffle while she watched, angling it to face the stones in the window. The effect was immediate, if subtle. The light seemed to gather rather than disperse, a dull brightness pooling where before it had fled. Marion nodded once. "You're shaping a room," she said, "not building one." When she left, she paused at the door. "People will talk," she added. "Let them. Quiet work lasts longer." By late afternoon, Ethan had mounted a simple frame to hold a salvaged pane of glass at an angle beneath the window, propped and secured with screws he could remove if necessary. He worked slowly, testing each point of contact, Rex stationed below like a sentry. The glass caught what little light the clouds allowed and redirected it toward the stones, which darkened as they absorbed the meager warmth. The thermometer climbed, hesitated, then nudged upward again. Ethan exhaled, careful not to count victories before they were earned. He spent the next hour banking snow deliberately against the exterior wall, packing it tight with a shovel until it formed a dense, insulating berm. The wind, denied its easy pathways, softened its voice. The crawl space felt calmer, less like a passage and more like a place. As dusk settled, the knock came again. Lighter this time. Ben Alvarez, a man in his late 20s with a narrow face and a beard that grew in uneven patches, stood on the porch holding a small crate. He worked nights at the clinic as an orderly, a job he'd taken after his younger brother's accident left him wary of chance. Ben had a nervous energy, hands that moved even when he stood still, but his eyes were kind and observant. "Sarah said you might want starters," he said, offering the crate. Inside were shallow trays filled with soil and dormant seeds, labeled in careful script. "Nothing fancy," he added quickly. "Hardy greens, thought you could test without committing." Ethan hesitated only a moment before accepting. "That's generous," he said. Ben shrugged. "Science likes trials." Rex sniffed the crate and sneezed softly, unimpressed. They set the trays near the stones, adjusting angles until the thermometer steadied a few degrees higher than it had the night before. Ben asked questions, Ethan answered, the exchange practical and brief. When Ben left, the house felt fuller, as if the idea itself had gained mass simply by being shared. Ethan checked the crawl space after dark, lantern light bouncing off reflective insulation, the glass pane glowing faintly. The thermometer held. Not high, never high, but above the line that mattered. He wrote the number down, then added a note. Wind control effective. Reflection increases stability. Test with trays. Upstairs, he cooked a simple dinner, Rex asleep with his back to the stove. Outside, the temperature dropped hard, the cold doing what it always did. Inside, the crawl space did not surrender as quickly. Near midnight, Ethan returned one last time. Kneeling to feel the stones, the soil in the trays cool but not cold. He rested his forearm on his knee, letting the quiet settle. This was not a triumph. It was a threshold. He closed the lantern, stood carefully, and climbed the stairs. Tomorrow would bring new variables, sun, cloud, doubt, but for now, the shape of the plan held. He shut the basement door gently, as if not to startle what he was trying to grow. The first signs of life did not announce themselves with color. They arrived as tension, a subtle change in the way the air behaved when Ethan Cole opened the basement door at dawn. The night had been clear and brutal, stars sharp as filings, the cold pressing in with renewed insistence. Yet when Ethan descended the stairs, lantern hooded to a soft glow, the crawl space met him with a steadiness that felt earned. The thermometer hovered just above the line he'd drawn in his notebook, the line that mattered, and held there as if daring him to trust it. Rex followed, his gait measured, nails clicking once before he settled near the trays Ben Alvarez had brought. Ethan knelt and placed his palm over the soil, not touching, just feeling the radiance lift faintly against his skin. It wasn't warm, it was alive with intention. He did not water immediately. He had learned to respect timing, to read conditions rather than impose them. Instead, he adjusted the reflective panel a fraction, tightened a seam he'd left loose for expansion, and waited for the light to arrive. When it did, thin and indirect, it caught the angled glass and slid downward toward the stones, gathering where the trays rested like an unspoken promise. Ethan watched the thermometer climb by half a degree, then another half. Rex's ears twitched at a distant sound, someone starting a truck up the road, but he stayed where he was, chin on his paws, a presence that made patience easier. When Ethan finally watered, he did it sparingly, using warmed water from the kettle, pouring slow and low to avoid shocking the soil. He had read enough to know that plants dislike surprises as much as people did. By late morning, he noticed the first change, a faint swelling beneath the surface of one tray, a suggestion rather than a fact. Ethan leaned closer, squinting, resisting the urge to touch. He marked the tray with a pencil stub and stepped back. The rule was simple: observe, record, intervene only when necessary. He followed it the way he had once followed checklists that kept men alive. The day passed with the steady accumulation of small tasks, shoveling the walk, repairing a hinge, preparing a simple meal, and with each return to the crawl space, the sense of pressure eased a little. The system was holding, not because winter had relented, but because it had been anticipated. That afternoon, Sarah Whitlow arrived with a bundle of long-necked glass bottles tucked into a crate, their dark surfaces dulled by age. She set them down carefully, her breath fogging as she shrugged out of her coat. "Thermal mass," she said, answering the question in Ethan's eyes. "Fill them with water. Paint them black if you feel ambitious. They'll store heat better than stone at this scale." Sarah had a way of offering solutions without demanding agreement, her posture relaxed, eyes alert. Ethan nodded and put the kettle back on. Together they filled the bottles, sealed them, and arranged them behind the trays where the reflective panel would do the most good. Rex supervised from his post, occasionally rising to reposition himself with the dignity of someone overseeing a complicated negotiation. They were mid-task when the knock came again. This time, it was Hannah Price, a woman in her late 40s with wind-burned cheeks and a cropped shock of auburn hair that refused to be tamed. She wore a down vest over flannel and carried a clipboard like a shield. Hannah worked for the county extension office, a role that had taught her to be both skeptical and generous in equal measure. A barn fire years earlier had taken her husband and left her with a cautious patience that showed in the way she listened before speaking. "Heard rumors," she said by way of greeting, her voice low and even. "Figured I'd see before I believed." Ethan didn't bristle. He showed her the setup, explained the sequence, pointed out the failures as readily as the successes. Hannah crouched, examined the seals, tapped the glass with a knuckle, and nodded once. "You're not promising miracles," she said. "That's good. If you get germination at this temp range, it'll matter." She left a pamphlet on ventilation and humidity control, then paused at the door. "People will ask," she added, Decide ahead of time how much you want to give." Ethan considered that long after she was gone. The change came 2 days later, quietly and without ceremony. Ethan noticed it while adjusting the bottles, his hand hovering over the marked tray. A thin arc of green had breached the soil, pale and tentative, the curve of it unmistakable. He sat back hard enough to feel it in his hip and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Rex rose and stepped closer, sniffed, then sat again, tail still. Sarah saw it a moment later and smiled, not broadly, not triumphantly, but with the contained satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. "There," she said. "That's your margin." They did not cheer. They took notes. Ethan measured temperature and humidity, checked the seals, recorded the time. When he finally allowed himself to look again, the green was still there, real and improbable. News traveled the way it always did in Leadville, sideways and imperfect. By evening, Ethan fielded 2 questions at the store and 1 raised eyebrow from Tom Avery as they crossed paths near the rail spur. Tom glanced at the crate of bottles in Ethan's truck bed and grunted. "Heard you're coaxing things to grow where they shouldn't," he said. Ethan shrugged. "Testing," he replied. Tom nodded once, a concession. "Good luck," he said, and meant it. That night the wind returned, less violent but persistent, probing for weaknesses. Ethan checked the crawl space at midnight, then again before dawn. The thermometer dipped and recovered. The seedling held. By the 4th day, green appeared in 2 more trays, stronger this time, the leaves unfolding with a deliberateness that felt like confidence. Ethan thinned the watering, opened a seam for a controlled breath of fresh air during the warmest hour, then sealed it again as the sun slipped away. Rex adapted his routine, choosing a new sleeping spot nearer the basement door, as if proximity mattered. Ethan found himself speaking to the plants the way he spoke to the dog, low, practical encouragement without sentimentality. He did not imagine gratitude. He imagined outcomes. On the 6th morning, a problem presented itself. Condensation beaded along the angled glass, heavy enough to drip, threatening the delicate stems. Ethan swore softly and adjusted the ventilation, propping the glass a fraction and angling the reflective panel to encourage circulation. He added a wick of cloth to guide runoff away from the trays, a solution improvised from the same instinct that once turned broken equipment into workable tools. The drip slowed, the leaves remained intact. Failure, narrowly avoided, wrote itself into the margins of his notebook. That evening, Ethan harvested nothing. He stood instead at the top of the basement stairs, listening to the quiet, the heater's hum, the distant wind. Rex leaned against his leg, solid and warm. The green at the edges of the trays was still small, still fragile, but it was no longer theoretical. It had crossed the threshold from idea to fact. Ethan closed the door gently, the way one does when there's something on the other side worth protecting. By the time February tightened its grip on Leadville, the crawl space beneath Ethan Cole's house had crossed an invisible line. It no longer felt like an experiment held together by patience and tape. It felt like a room with a purpose, one that demanded daily attention and returned that attention with small, measurable rewards. The seedlings had thickened, their pale beginnings deepening into confident greens that stood upright without assistance. Ethan measured growth the way he measured temperature, carefully, without embellishment, tracking leaf length, stem strength, and the subtle changes in color that signaled health rather than hope. Rex had adjusted fully to the new rhythm, choosing to station himself at the top of the basement stairs whenever Ethan worked below. His body angled outward as if guarding the boundary between the ordinary house and the improbable space beneath it. The first harvest did not happen all at once. It arrived as a decision. Ethan stood in the crawl space one afternoon, hands resting on his knees, and considered a cluster of outer leaves that had reached maturity ahead of the rest. He knew the rule, cut from the edges, leave the center to grow, but knowing a rule and trusting it were different things. He reached for the shears, paused, then made a clean cut. The sound was small and decisive. He gathered the leaves into a bowl and carried them upstairs, Rex following with quiet interest. The leaves washed clean easily, the cold water beading and running off their surfaces. When Ethan tasted one, he didn't close his eyes or smile. He nodded. The flavor was crisp, green, unmistakably fresh. The system had crossed another line. Word traveled faster after that, propelled not by rumor, but by evidence. Sarah Whitlow brought a friend one afternoon, Lucas Moreno, a man in his mid-30s with a neatly trimmed beard and hands permanently stained by ink from his work as a freelance surveyor. Lucas had grown up in a warmer place and still wore winter like a borrowed coat, his posture slightly hunched against it. He asked precise questions, took measurements, and sketched diagrams without asking permission. "This changes assumptions," he said finally, not looking up from his notebook. Ethan appreciated the phrasing. Not miracles. Assumptions. Hannah Price returned with a clipboard and a small digital hygrometer, her skepticism softened but intact. She observed the airflow, noted the humidity range, and offered suggestions without directive. "If you scale," she said, "scale slowly. Systems break when enthusiasm outruns maintenance." The town's attention brought friction along with curiosity. At the hardware store, Caleb Horn raised an eyebrow when Ethan bought additional fasteners and a second pane of salvaged glass. "You building a cathedral under there?" he asked, half smiling. Ethan shook his head. "Just keeping things alive," he said. Outside, Tom Avery watched Ethan load a crate of cut greens into his truck and said nothing, but his nod was different this time, less skeptical, more appraising. Even Ben Alvarez changed his tone, less tentative, more engaged. "If this holds another week," he said, "we should test different varieties." Ethan agreed, already thinking in margins. The pressure came unexpectedly, and from a direction Ethan hadn't anticipated. Franklin Frank Dorsey, a man in his early 50s with a heavy build and a beard that grew in dense, unruly patches, stopped by one morning unannounced. Frank owned a struggling diner on the edge of town, his temper a byproduct of long hours and thinner margins than he liked to admit. A back injury years earlier had left him impatient with anything that moved slowly, including people. He stood on Ethan's porch with his hands jammed into his coat pockets, jaw set. "Heard you're growing greens," he said, not quite accusatory but not friendly either. Ethan invited him in without comment. Downstairs, Frank took in the space with a frown that gradually loosened into something else. Interest, perhaps, or calculation. "People will want this," he said. "You selling?" Ethan considered the question longer than Frank seemed to expect. "Not yet," he said finally. Frank snorted. "Someone will," he replied, and left without saying goodbye. The encounter lingered, less as a threat than as a reminder that success, even small success, attracted gravity. The real test came with the storm. It arrived on a Thursday night, announced by a sudden drop in pressure and a wind that rose fast and mean. Snow drove sideways, finding every weakness, testing every seal. Ethan woke twice to check the system, Rex on his heels, lantern light flashing off reflective panels that shuddered but held. At 3 a.m., the power flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the house into silence. Ethan's heart kicked hard once, then settled. He lit the lantern and went downstairs, breath fogging. Without the heater, the system had to rely on what it had stored. He checked the thermometer. It was dropping, but slowly. The stones and bottles radiated their held warmth like a stubborn argument against the cold. Ethan banked more snow outside by lantern light, his shovel scraping in the dark, Rex stationed nearby, ears pinned against the wind. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The power returned mid-morning with a hum that felt almost intrusive. Ethan descended again, half expecting loss. Instead, he found the seedlings bent but intact, the temperature hovering just above the critical line. He leaned against the wall and laughed once, short, surprised, then stopped, embarrassed by the sound. Rex wagged his tail once, twice, and pressed his shoulder into Ethan's leg. The system had held without assistance. That mattered. The storm changed the conversation. People arrived with fewer questions and more offers. Marion Pike brought a box of old ledgers she no longer needed, their covers perfect for insulating panels. Lucas Moreno returned with clearer sketches and a suggestion for a removable vent. Hannah Price left a note approving the setup as a viable seasonal extension and offered to connect Ethan with others interested in learning. Even Frank Dorsey came back, quieter this time. "If you've got extra," he said, eyes not quite meeting Ethan's, "I could use it." Ethan handed him a small bundle without charge. Frank took it, nodded once, and left a 20 on the counter anyway. That evening, Ethan cooked a simple meal and shared it with Rex on the kitchen floor, greens folded into something warm and sustaining. He thought about lines, how easily they blurred once crossed, and about the responsibility that came with proving something possible. He didn't feel triumphant, he felt accountable. Downstairs, the crawl space hummed softly with stored heat and growing things, no longer hidden, no longer just his. Ethan closed the basement door gently and wrote a single line in his notebook. Storm test passed. Interest increasing. Decide boundaries. He set the pencil down and listened to the quiet, aware that the next phase would demand more than patience. It would demand choices. March crept toward Leadville with the caution of an animal that had been hurt before. Days lengthened by minutes rather than hours, and the light gained a faint honeyed quality that softened the edges of the snow without truly melting it. Ethan Cole felt the shift in his body before he trusted it in the air. His leg ached less in the mornings. His breath didn't scrape as sharply in his chest. Downstairs, the crawl space responded in kind. Temperatures rose a degree or two during the day and fell back at night without crossing the line that mattered. The plants thickened, leaves broadening and darkening, stems gaining a resilience that felt earned. Rex, 9 and slowing in small ways Ethan pretended not to notice, adopted a new habit of lying just inside the basement doorway, head on paws, eyes tracking movement with the quiet authority of someone who knew where he belonged. With success came decisions, and with decisions came the need to draw lines. Ethan had learned that lesson in uniform, where boundaries were the difference between mission and mess. He spent a morning making lists, not of materials this time, but of rules. Who could come down? When? What could be shared freely and what required time he did not have. He was not hoarding knowledge, he was protecting a system that worked because it was tended. He wrote the rules plainly and taped them inside the kitchen cabinet where he would have to see them every day. Rex watched from the rug, tail still, as if approving the seriousness of the task. The first line was tested sooner than he expected. A knock came late afternoon, firm and impatient. Dennis Ward stood on the porch, his shoulders hunched inside a canvas jacket that had seen too many winters. Dennis was in his early 40s, broad through the chest with a beard he kept trimmed close to the jaw and eyes that rarely rested. He had served in the same conflict as Ethan, though in a different unit, and the war had left him with a restlessness that made stillness feel like a provocation. He worked construction when he could and drank when he couldn't. "Heard you're the guy," Dennis said, skipping pleasantries, "growing food under your house." Ethan invited him in, offered coffee, kept his voice even. Dennis took in the kitchen, the notebook on the counter, the taped rules inside the cabinet door. "You could scale this," Dennis said. "Make it pay." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet," he said. Dennis scoffed. "People are hungry now." The words landed heavier than Dennis likely intended. Ethan felt the old reflex, defend, justify, but let it pass. "I'll share what I can," he said instead. "I won't break what works." Dennis stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and contained. "Fair," he said, and left without another word. That evening, Ethan met Sarah Whitlow at the library after hours, the building quiet and warm with stored air. They sat at a long table under yellowed lights, papers spread between them. Sarah listened as Ethan described the pressure, the requests, the line he felt forming under his feet. "You're not obligated to be everything," she said, "but you are obligated to be honest about what you can sustain." She sketched a simple framework, open days, limited numbers, shared labor rather than transactions. "People value what they work for," she added. Ethan nodded. He knew that truth intimately. The open day came on a Saturday, announced with a single handwritten sign at the hardware store and a note at the library desk. Ethan limited it to 6 visitors at a time, 2 hours total. He prepared like it was an inspection, tools put away, pathways clear, notes ready. Rex wore his old working collar, not because it meant anything to anyone else, but because it reminded Ethan of standards. The first group descended the stairs quietly, voices lowering instinctively as the space revealed itself. Marion Pike moved slowly, palm resting on the rail, eyes bright. Hannah Price took notes, Lucas Moreno measured angles and smiled without meaning to. Frank Dorsey lingered at the back, hands in pockets, gaze softening when he saw the leaves. No one touched without asking, no one joked. The room imposed its own discipline. Halfway through, the hinge on the angled glass panel groaned, a sharp, metallic complaint that cut the quiet. Ethan moved immediately, bracing the panel, checking the screws. A small failure, caught early. "That's why limits," he said aloud, not accusing, just stating fact. Heads nodded. When the session ended, people thanked him without effusion and filed out, boots crunching softly. Ethan sat on the bottom step afterward, pulse slowing, Rex leaning against his thigh. The line had held. The second test came from the weather again, as it always did. A warm spell, too warm, rolled through, sun bright and deceptive. The crawl space climbed into a range that risked leggy growth and disease. Ethan adjusted ventilation, propped the glass, and set a simple timer to remind himself to check humidity. He slept lightly, waking twice to make small corrections. By morning, the plants had adapted, leaves angled toward the altered light, stems holding. He wrote it down. Warm spell response. Vent early, monitor moisture. Systems didn't care about intentions, they cared about attention. A week later, Dennis Ward returned, this time with a woman and a child. Lena Ward was slight and sharp-eyed, her dark hair pulled into a practical knot, her posture protective without being closed. The child, Milo, 7, thin as a reed, held a toy truck with missing wheels and watched Rex with unabashed awe. Dennis cleared his throat. "We could use some help," he said, voice stripped of bravado. Ethan didn't ask for details. He led them downstairs, showed them the leaves ready to cut, explained the rule again. Milo crouched and stared, mouth open. "It's like a secret," he whispered. Rex lay down and allowed the boy to touch his shoulder, a gift given rarely. Ethan handed Lena a bundle of greens and a list of steps, nothing proprietary, nothing fragile. "Start small," he said. "Keep it boring." Lena nodded, gratitude tight in her throat. Dennis met Ethan's eyes and said, "Thank you," like it cost him something. As March edged closer to April, Ethan noticed Rex slowing more decisively. The dog rose with effort now, joints stiff, breath a little heavier after stairs. Ethan adjusted routines without ceremony, shorter walks, more rest, a bed placed closer to warmth. One afternoon, as they worked in the crawl space, Rex lay down and didn't rise right away. Ethan knelt, ran a hand along the familiar curve of spine and shoulder, felt the steady heart beneath. "We're okay," he murmured, unsure who he meant it for. Rex's tail thumped once, the chapter closed with a decision written plainly. Ethan pinned a new note beside the rules. Open day bi-weekly, labor trade preferred, no sales until stability proven. He stood back, evaluated the line he'd drawn, and accepted the cost. Outside, snow softened under a higher sun. Inside, the green held. Ethan turned off the lantern and climbed the stairs with Rex close behind, aware that boundaries were not walls but agreements, renewed daily, tested often, and worth the work. April did not arrive in Leadville the way people imagined spring should. It came in pauses, days where the sun lingered just long enough to soften the snow, nights that still snapped cold, and mornings scented faintly with meltwater and iron-rich earth. The town learned to read these pauses the way miners once read rock, searching for signs of what might last. Ethan Cole read them too, but his attention had narrowed to the rhythm beneath his house, where the crawl space had completed its quiet transformation. It was no longer merely stable, it was productive. Leaves grew broad and dark, herbs sent up confident stems, and the soil, once inert, held a living warmth that responded to care rather than luck. Rex, now unmistakably gray around the muzzle, spent most mornings lying at the top of the basement stairs, rising only when Ethan descended, as if the work below required formal accompaniment. Ethan's days had settled into a pattern that felt earned, morning checks before coffee, adjustments made with a screwdriver and a notebook rather than guesses. Harvests taken carefully, shared according to the rules he'd written and revised. He did not expand the system further. Instead, he refined it. Vent angles were marked, watering schedules standardized. the reflective panels cleaned and repositioned with the season's changing light. He had learned that sustainability was not growth for its own sake, but the ability to repeat success without exhaustion. The open days continued bi-weekly, small groups rotating through with questions that grew sharper and more informed. People brought their own notebooks now. They listened. They helped carry stones or shovel snow without being asked. The crawl space taught them how to behave. The town changed in small, uncelebrated ways. Frank Dorsey's diner added a simple salad to the menu, chalkboard written and gone by noon. He never mentioned where the greens came from, but he left a basket of bread on Ethan's porch every Thursday anyway. Hannah Price connected 3 families who built modest versions of the system under their own homes, each adapted to circumstance and skill. Marion Pike hosted evening talks at the library, her voice steady as she guided discussion away from novelty and toward practice. Lucas Moreno drew up clean schematics and offered them freely, refining angles and clearances with a surveyor's precision. Sarah Whitlow moved through it all like a current, advising, correcting gently, celebrating quietly when data confirmed what patience had promised. The final test came not from weather or pressure, but from letting go. Rex slowed further as April warmed, his rising now deliberate, his steps careful. Ethan adjusted again, shorter descents, a ramp added to the stairs, a bed placed halfway down so the dog could rest without surrendering his post. One afternoon, as Ethan worked below, Rex lay down and did not follow. Ethan froze, heart thudding, then felt the steady presence at his back. Rex had chosen the landing, close enough to guard, far enough to spare his joints. Ethan knelt and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of fur and soap and earth. They stayed that way for a moment, neither in a hurry to move. Late in the month, a small gathering formed without announcement. It was not an open day. It was a thank you that had found its own shape. Dennis Ward arrived with Lena and Milo, the boy clutching a new toy truck, this one intact. Dennis's beard was trimmed, his eyes steadier. "We've got sprouts," Lena said, pride threading her voice. "Not much, but they're ours." Ben Alvarez brought seed trays he'd raised at the clinic under grow lights, eager to compare notes. Tom Avery tied Luna to the fence and came in smelling of leather and snowmelt, nodding at the angled glass with an expression that suggested respect had replaced doubt. No one crowded. No one spoke loudly. They stood among the leaves and felt what it meant to be early rather than late. Ethan did not give a speech. He answered questions as they came and deflected praise the way he always had. When Milo asked if the plants would remember winter, Ethan knelt and thought about it. "They remember stress," he said finally, "and they grow better for it." Milo nodded as if this explained more than plants. Rex allowed the boy to sit beside him, the old dog's warmth a lesson without words. As May approached, the ground outside finally gave in. Shovels bit into soil that yielded rather than rang. People began to plant in the open, the crawl space shifting from miracle to model. Ethan harvested less, shared less, and felt no guilt about it. The system had done what it needed to do. It had carried them through the dangerous months. On the last open day of the season, Ethan posted a simple note. "Season closed. Notes available. Build yours when ready." He took the sign down the following week and folded it into the notebook, an artifact rather than a promise. The ending arrived quietly, the way the beginning had. One evening, as the sun stretched longer shadows across the yard, Ethan sat on the basement steps with Rex beside him, the lantern unlit. The crawl space glowed with the last of the day's light, leaves stirring faintly as air moved through the vents he'd marked months earlier. Above them, the house hummed with ordinary life. No urgency, no alarms. Ethan rested his hand on Rex's shoulder and felt the dog lean back, satisfied. "We made it," Ethan said, not triumphantly, but with the simple accuracy of someone stating a fact. Rex's tail thumped once. When summer came in earnest, Ethan dismantled nothing. He cleaned, labeled, and left the structure in place, ready to be used again when it mattered. He accepted a part-time role with the extension office, not as an expert, but as a demonstrator, and he agreed to help others build without charging more than time and materials. He kept the notebook, now thick with margins and corrections, on a shelf where it could be reached without ceremony. Leadville did not become famous, it became steadier. The season that had tested them answered back with restraint and generosity. Ethan Cole did not build a business or a monument, he built a way through winter and shared it without spectacle. Rex aged into a gentler vigilance, content to guard thresholds rather than front lines. Beneath the house, the green rested, waiting for the cold that would come again. And when it did, there would be no surprise, only preparation, patience, and the quiet confidence of work done well. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They come quietly, in the choice to keep going when everything feels lost, in hands that keep working when the heart is tired, in the loyalty of a dog who refuses to leave, and in a person the world has already given up on. God does not always remove the winter from our lives, but He teaches us how to plant seeds in the cold. If today you feel worn down, forgotten, or alone, remember this. As long as you are still moving forward, God is still working, silently, patiently, shaping something good beneath the surface, just like green shoots growing under snow. Take a moment to share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment if you believe miracles still exist in the simplest acts of faith and perseverance. And if you believe no person or animal should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal. May God bless you, your family, and everyone watching this video. May He protect you in difficult seasons, strengthen you when you are weary, and lead you toward the light exactly when you need it most. Amen.